Hi everyone, this is the fourth and final video in this series about development and in psychology we're studying the lifespan and human development over time, and in this last video I will cover sexual development and also characteristics of physical development as well as the psychosocial development theories that were created by Erik Erikson. So let's start with some of those foundational terms that relate to physical and sexual development. Some of these terms are important even for just understanding the beginnings of development as well as in adolescence. So some of these terms you might be familiar with from biology, but we'll go ahead and start with the basics. So an X chromosome is found in both males and females, but with two X chromosomes, this will produce a female child. A Y chromosome is only found in males. So an XX pair would produce a female and an XY pair would produce a male. So then the next term is testosterone, and a lot of times students are familiar with this term and really only associate it with males, but testosterone is a hormone that is found in both males and females, but the additional amount found in males actually stimulates the growth of the male sex organs during fetal development, and also some of those secondary sex characteristics that occur in puberty. So let's define a couple more terms that I just used. So puberty, this is when people mature sexually. It happens in adolescence. There are different types of sex characteristics that differentiate between male and female. A primary sex characteristics, this would be something that is necessary for reproduction. So this would be things like ovaries, testicles, any of the genitalia that is important for reproduction that differentiates male from female, that would be primary. Secondary sex characteristics, these are things that are I think of more physical traits, things like breasts and hips for females, or for males, things like tonal voice quality, or the broadening of shoulders, also like facial hair. Some of those things are physical traits that differentiate male and female. Those would be secondary sex characteristics. There are two more terms that are terms that also help mark development and changes over time. And you can see those at the bottom of the screen. These apply to females. The first one is menarche. And menarche is a term that typically people are just not really familiar with, but I think you know what it is, you just typically don't use this term. Menarche happens in adolescence for females, and this is when menstruation starts. So this is when a female starts her period. That's called menarche, and that is like the marker for the beginning of like puberty in females. Now, menarche ends with a term you're probably more familiar with, which is menopause. So menopause refers to at the end of that stage, and that is when a woman is experiencing changes in her ability to reproduce. And so this is when menstruation ends. And so after menopause, she's no longer able to reproduce because menstruation has stopped. So those are some terms that help define development, especially physical development, but also when it refers to the differences between men and women. The next slide covers a change that has occurred in the way that we mark the developmental spans. So these like frames of time. For a long time, it went from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. But as you can see on this timeline, there has been some changes over time. You can see there's 100 years difference. It starts in the 1890s, and you can see there's this change that occurs in the 1990s. And it has to do with just the almost expansion of adolescence, and there's a lot of things that have contributed to this. So first, adolescence is this transition from childhood to adulthood. We usually think of it starting with puberty and developing this independence and then ending with becoming an adult. But what has happened is the way that just life has changed over 100 years is just things have changed. So people tend to have children later. They marriage has been extended later. Even in this time period, people are moving from adolescence to still being dependent on parents and reliant on parents, whether that is going to college but yet still being reliant on parents or living with parents. There's just all these factors that come into play that are extending the independence of adulthood. And because of this, there is a new stage that has been labeled as emerging adulthood. So moving from childhood to adolescence, there's this new stage between adolescence and adulthood called emerging adulthood. And that's this time period, it's a gap between adolescence and adulthood where a person is not yet fully independent and is still still a little bit reliant on parents and not yet married or into those next stages that we might say mark adulthood. And so now there's this new stage called emerging adulthood. Next, we have the social clock. And the social clock is something that you feel. It's something that you have experienced. The social clock is just a term that is referring to this culturally expected or preferred timing of social events, such as marriage or parenthood or retirement. You feel this social clock whenever maybe you haven't met this expected time that society thinks you should be doing something, meeting some milestone, and usually someone brings it up to you. So it's this time frame when you're supposed to meet this social milestone. So for example, you in high school are probably experiencing this expected time to know where you want to go to college, or maybe what you want to do, what you want to major in. And so people are probably asking you those things. Where are you going to go to college? And when you get older and you age, the questions will change. There will be these expectations. When are you getting married? When are you having children? When are you going to have a career, decide your career? Or when are you going to retire, buy a home? All of these things are these socially expected milestones that you're supposed to meet and, or, supposed to culturally meet. And that's called your social clock. Next, we have Erik Erikson, and Erik Erikson was a developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst. He is most notable for his ideas of identity crisis, and he termed that idea of an identity crisis. He actually would call the identity your sense of self, and he believes your identity is actually changing through these different crises you experience throughout your lifetime. And these crises that you come against are kind of like social crises that you come up against. And depending on how you meet these social crises affects how you develop and how well adjusted you are. So he would say your social identity is your sense of self and connection with others, and that shapes who you are, and that you go through these crises throughout your life. So you can see there are these different crises that you go through, and just depending on how you come out of that crisis depends on how well adjusted you are. So let's go through some of these different crises that occur. So the first one is trust versus mistrust. And so this is a crisis that happens in infancy, and this is a crisis that is kind of dependent on your caregivers and whether or not you can trust them. And so this is a really important stage that is often the social factor is kind of revolving around the parents and whether the parents are going to be there when you need them, and whether or not they are kind of determines how you come out of that crisis. And if you're going to be feeling like the world is consistent and reliable, and failure to have this trust met can make you feel like the world is unpredictable and cause fear in you. The next crisis, social crisis that people go through, he says, is autonomy, which is like independence, versus shame and doubt. And so Erik Erikson would say that toddlers are going through this crisis where they are starting to do things on their own, and if they aren't able to, or if they're met with criticism when they try to do something on their own, they might start to doubt their abilities. And so Erik Erikson would say that parents should be really careful in toddlerhood, or caregivers should be careful not to punish a child when they fail at doing something, a toddler, because they're trying new things on their own for the first time, potty training, and maybe they don't get it right every time, and maybe they wet their pants, but shaming them will cause them to not feel confident in doing things and being independent on their own. Next is the crisis that occurs in the preschool age years, where this is not yet into grade school, but this is the age where kids are starting to initiate tasks with others. So playing games with other kids and kind of like starting to take initiative to take the lead in things. They might start creating their own games and activities, and they should be allowed to make some of these decisions on their own, and that will help them become more confident. But if it doesn't work out and they're either like shunned for trying something new, or it just doesn't work out to take initiative to play these games with others, they can feel guilty and not develop into a well-adjusted child. The next stage is grade school. So this is like elementary school, and he would say the crisis that's occurring here is called industry, which is like your like industriousness is like working at things versus inferiority. And he would say these elementary age kids, what the crisis is they are completing tasks, and they are also completing tasks around other kids. And what's happening is they might start comparing themselves to others in the classroom. They might start to see their own abilities in things relative to other kids. And Erickson places a lot of that social interaction on the teacher and other kids, and that teacher should be really careful because kids are trying to create things, and they're trying to do, and their feeling of competency is developing. And if they can feel unsure of themselves when they are working on things and creating things. And if they come out of this not feeling confident in what they're able to do, they might start to feel inferior. The next crisis that occurs is in the teenage years. He says that this is the crisis of identity. And in the teenage years, adolescents are just kind of answering those questions about who am I, and how do I fit in, and what am I going to be like in life, and kind of exploring like who they are and their beliefs and their goals and their values, and even the sense of what's right and wrong, like we talked about in the previous video. And Erickson said that parents should allow those teenagers to kind of fill out what are those things and determine who they are. But if a parent is just continually pushing that child to conform, they might face this feeling of confusion about who am I. The next crisis is intimacy versus isolation, and this happens after adulthood after adolescence into young adulthood. And this is this time, this crisis of relationships, and this is when marriage is often happening, or just developing really deep friendships and relationships. 18 to 40 is about when this is happening, and this is when like intimate love and socially connectedness is just really important. This is typically like moving from dating to marriage, and family relationships are really important in this stage. And if some of those things aren't happening, people might start to feel isolated and alone if they're not making these deep connections with others. And that doesn't necessarily mean marriage, although it does happen in this time. Erickson would say that this is a time where the need for just relationships and deep connections with others is very important. So the next crisis that occurs is in the middle adulthood, and this is the age where the crisis of, is what I'm doing making a difference? So generativity, this is like what I'm producing in the world. Possibly this is thinking about careers or what I'm doing in my family. Is this contributing? And if it's not contributing, they might have this feeling of stagnation and just like not producing and feeling like you're contributing in your community or in their organizations. And they might not feel like their life is progressing. They might have feelings of feeling useless. And so this is in that middle age crisis, he would say. The last and final crisis is at the end, in older adulthood, integrity versus despair. And this is the last stage when he says that older adults are having this sense of either satisfaction with their life or failure. And he said during this crisis in life, they're really feeling about, was I successful? Did I meet those goals? And if not, feeling depressed and hopeless. And so these are the crises that he says really contribute to your identity.